thank you everyone for joining our workshop today on designing community-led resilience hubs with clean energy. We are hoping to lead an interactive session today with speakers from PSE Healthy Energy, which is a research institute based out of Oakland, California. We study energy and climate solutions that protect public health and the environment. And we have Communities for a Better Environment here as well. Communities for a Better Environment is one of the preeminent environmental justice organizations in the US, and their mission is to build people power in California, communities of color and low-income communities to achieve environmental health and justice. So we will begin the webinar with about 30 minutes of presentations. We're going to be hearing from both of these groups, just sharing tools and experiences around resilience, hub design, and communities. And then we're going to open it up, and we'd love to have this be really interactive and have folks ask questions. So as we get started, please drop any questions you may have into the chat, and then we'll have an open Q&A session at the end. And if you see questions that you like being added to the chat, or comments and sentiments that you like, please feel free to upvote them by reacting in the chat, and we'll be tracking that and making sure we address it at the end. And then just to kick ourselves off, we'd love to see folks introduce themselves in the chat as well. So just giving your name, where you're coming from would be great. All right, I will kick it over to our first presenter. So Laura, do you want to?
Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Laura, as already mentioned. So yeah, Communities for a Better Environment. We're a statewide environmental justice organization. We work with community members, scientists, or researchers, and lawyers. So I wanted to start the conversation off with really grounding ourselves in, and I'm going to project because my window unit is literally right here. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So really wanted to ground ourselves in what does resilience mean? Why is it necessary? And more importantly, how are we making sure that we're really leading equitable climate community-led solutions? And so to start that conversation off, well, first, I'm based in Los Angeles, unceded Tongva land, and when we talk about environmental justice, we really recognize that the solutions that are necessary to address the climate crisis are holistic. That folks that are living on the front lines of climate change, that are living on the front lines of industries that have put us in the position that have accelerated the climate crisis, they're the ones that are most disproportionately impacted. And so there's a quote that one of our community organizers says, and it says, "Climate change starts in our hoods and climate change ends in our hoods." And I know we can't really end climate change, but the spirit is there. The spirit is that frontline communities, environmental justice communities, and low-income communities of color, because of racist, historical disinvestment and redlining, end up living or have lived for decades right next to polluting industries. And that's very real in Wilmington, which is where this project is based. There are 5 refineries that surround Wilmington. There are over 300 oil drilling sites and a lot of other industry that will need in order for the refineries to operate. And if we're really leading climate solutions, we need to make sure that we're addressing the situation that people are currently living in. We can't talk about a climate crisis happening in 100 years. Folks have been experiencing this now, and they have been experiencing it for many years now. And so the purpose of resilience hubs for us is something that community leaders have designed, community members have identified as needs that they currently need because of cumulative impacts, and as well as being able to adapt to the climate crisis and climate impacts in Los Angeles. Yeah, and just making sure that it's with community, making sure that the folks that will be utilizing the space are there and leading. I don't think I need to tell you all that the climate crisis is real. You all know this, we know this. I think it's just really important for us to ground the conversation in, yes, everyone, climate change is happening to everyone, but not everyone is able to adapt as easily as everyone. Not everyone has access to resources as easily as everyone. And we really need to recognize where different communities are coming from in order for us to truly advance climate solutions. Yeah.
So Elena, I think it goes to you.
Okay, can we switch on to the next slide? Thanks, Laura. I hope so. Again, good morning, everybody, and thanks for being here. Thanks, Laura, for that introduction. So the project that brought us here today is a collaboration between PSC, CBE, and the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, who unfortunately could not join, but our lead partner there is out on sabbatical and hopefully having a wonderful time right now. We are supported in this project by the Strategic Growth Council's Climate Change Research Program. But I also want to emphasize that a lot of this is part of a much broader body of work that CBE and APAN have been doing for a long time, building out resilience in their communities. For this specific work, we've been thinking about how do we reconcile how we think about resilience at different scales. As Laura said, we are trying to build resilience in communities, and this has to be community-led and from the ground up. But how can we also think about how do we support resilience and resilience hubs build out sort of across the state, and what does that actually take? So what PSC has been doing has been looking at 18,000 candidate resilience hubs. That's schools, community centers, places of worship, library, across all of California, and trying to analyze designs. What will it take to put solar and storage at each site? What if you need it to last through a 3-day outage on a hot summer day or in the middle of the winter? Where is this going to be really hard or expensive based on utility rates or based on the climate or the weather? Where do we maybe need more incentives to support resilience? Where is this maybe financeable of some kind? And where are there communities that are particularly vulnerable? How many hubs do you need to make sure everyone in a disadvantaged community lives within half a mile of a hub, or areas with extreme heat or smoke? And how do we even think about vulnerability in this context that inherently includes our values and what we think is important, who we think is vulnerable, and how we sort of think about that? So PSC has been sort of taking this top-down view, and then APAN and CBE really leading this bottom up. What does resilience mean in our communities? You know, working with community members, running workshops, doing surveys, and then building out hubs in Wilmington, in Oakland, in Richmond, California. Again, APAN isn't here, but I do want to say, please check out their website. Look at the amazing work that they've been doing with the RISE Center in Richmond, working with youth there in order to identify both programming needs and resilience needs at that hub site. And now they're working on the Lincoln Rec Center in Chinatown's, in Oakland's Chinatown. So today we're going to talk about some of the work that we're doing, both trying to think strategically about resilience sort of across the state. And that includes some tools that PSC has developed, looking at things like where there are public safety power shutoffs. What do we know about all of these sort of candidate resilience subsites and who lives nearby? And we hope these will be helpful if you're applying for grants, if you're working with community government and trying to think about, you know, where you might try to look for partners in your community, and thinking at the state level about strategically, like, how do we think about funding and financing and where this is going to be hard? And then, you know, Laura is going to walk through some tools and things that they've been doing from the ground up that hopefully can support the work that you are doing to figure out what your communities really need. This will be different from place to place. Everywhere's going to be unique, but hopefully that story will help give a sense of what this might take. And again, I encourage you to take a look at what APAN is doing as well to sort of get a, you know, slightly different storyline in some of that work. We're going to keep on having other tools and other materials coming out throughout the fall. And so we'll touch on that later, but hopefully we'll have some additional toolkits and things that can support all the work that you're doing. So I'm going to pass this over to Laura to talk about the work that CBE is doing in Wilmington.
Yeah, thanks. So our work so far has been pretty, cyclical. We've been going in different rounds. Um, the project started in 2013. I won't go back that far, but it did start around community visioning. So I think at that time when we were talking about climate change, climate justice, and resilience and adaptation, we weren't really talking about holistic solutions, and we definitely weren't talking about environmental justice communities and disproportionate impacts. So I do think there's been a huge shift, which is great. It's amazing that we're talking about the different ways that communities are able to respond differently to climate events. So we had to do a lot of internal education. We've had to do that education with members to make sure that our curriculum and our language is also reflecting their lived experiences. One of the ways that we started doing like this visioning for what community resilience centers look like was to really just print out a giant map. And we like had folks, we invited them to our office, we had food, we people plotted out where do they go right now? Where would you go? Where's the library? Where can you get water? If the power goes out, where would you go? If it's really hot, where do you go? And so from there, we really identified 2 trusted sites that folks really engaged with, and that was the Tucci Clinic and the Senior Center in Wilmington. And since then, we've started, we've had partnerships with them. We've continued to build our relationship with them. And we got really lucky where one of our partners was able to get funding to install solar and storage at the Senior Center. So the Senior Center is now equipped with solar and storage. And we are in the process of doing that same installation at the Tucci Clinic. While we've been installing that infrastructure that's necessary for Resilience Hub, we were also, doing surveys with the community to find out, what time would they even be going into the center? What resources would they like to see at that center? So these are just some of the survey results that we found that I think were pretty interesting. A lot of the majority of the people that took the survey, a lot of them had dependents. This number here, the average 4 people, minimum 2, max 7, this is how many people lived in a household. And I think that's really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about communities. So the housing stock in Wilmington is very old. So to think about 7 people living in one household where they might not have access to AC, they might not have backup they might not have backup storage, access to energy. A lot of them were like intergenerational households, so a lot of elders. And thinking about like, do they need any medical equipment, any medical devices? And so we relayed all this information with the Tucci Clinic and the Wilmington Senior Center. And we've been working around like, how do we address those needs if we know that folks don't have that at their home? And I did want to just quick, like Elena said, we will be able to, you'll be able to see all of this in the future because we're going to be releasing all this information. We're creating a story map, but I really wanted to just quickly scroll through so you could see what our survey looked like. It was a very lengthy, we learned a lot from this process, definitely wordsmithing some of it, but we wanted to make sure that, we were really getting an idea of where folks were located, how far they felt comfortable walking, and what resources they really wanted at that site. And that's really important to support the site in building out their capacity. We summarize those results into this graphic that you can find on our website. I'm just skimming, and again, all of this will be available on our story map. And then building out our curriculum with our membership, we created zines to really talk about what are resilience hubs. And you'll see that both of them are in English and Spanish, because that's the base that we work with. That's the majority of our membership. So yeah, all of this will be available for in a little while on our story map. So hopefully it's helpful to you. And I really just want to drive down the fact that as we're envisioning and designing these hubs, really making sure that it's happening alongside community to address their needs and make sure that you have the folks that you've built this thing out, that they'll be able to go, they'll feel comfortable, they have access to it. Yeah.
So as Elena mentioned, part of this work was also mapping outages because losing power for extended periods of time can have serious consequences on members of the community. You know, food and medication can spoil, you can miss work, miss school. If you rely on electrical powered medical devices, you know, that can be really dangerous. And we know that outages aren't felt equally by members of the community or from different communities. Those with fewer resources, such as low income and historically disadvantaged communities, are likely to be hit harder. So millions of people have experienced long duration outages in California in the form of public safety power shutoffs, otherwise known as PSPS events. These occur when utilities proactively shut off power to different power lines that are in high fire risk areas to avoid accidentally sparking a wildfire. Given the potentially serious consequences of these events, these outages have really strict and very detailed reporting requirements, including, you know, which circuits had their power shut off, how many households were impacted, and how long people went without power. So while only the state's 6 investor-owned utilities are required to report on PSPS events, these utilities cover almost 90% of California's residents. So we were able to use these events as a reasonable proxy for outages. For instance, you know, getting an average outage duration, which is useful for solar and storage planning. And it also mapping these outages allowed us to explore trends and outage impacts. So using the PSPS post-event reports and locations of impacted circuits, we mapped PSPS outages across the state, assigning impacts such as number of customers impacted, and sort of frequency and duration of these different outages, mapping these to census tracts. And we did this across all historical data that we have on PSPS events starting in 2013. So unsurprisingly, PSPS outages correspond to high fire threat districts. And though interestingly, census tracts that experienced the most frequent outages were in Southern California, while census tracts that experienced the longest duration outages happened more often in Northern California. So we also overlaid this map data with socioeconomic and demographic data to explore trends in these outages, trying to understand who is experiencing PSPS outages most frequently, you know, getting a sense for the communities impacted. So this data is now its own set of interactive maps, which I think Adrian just put the link in the chat. You can go explore them. These maps include interactive filters for both outages and impacted communities. For instance, you can focus on a single utility or only on outages that lasted a certain duration, or you can look at outages that only impacted disadvantaged communities or impacted communities with a certain CalEnviro screen score. So one map is by outage frequency, and this frequency is an annualized frequency. So since the utility that is doing their PSPS events started reporting, how many events has this census tract experience or likely experienced each year? And one is on sort of the average duration of PSPS outages that the census tract has experienced. Some of this data is also included as a layer within the larger Resilience Hubs mapping tool. This can help users to see if their community has historically been impacted by PSPS events, which, you know, helps inform resilience planning, as well as offer certain avenues of different funding that require a community to have experienced PSPS.
Another layer underneath the resilience modeling tool is the energy use at the sites. To come to these sites, we scraped nearly 20,000 potential resilience hubs, including community centers, community colleges, primary schools, secondary schools, and centers of worship. Community centers includes libraries, Elks clubs, community gyms, and a wide range of things. And one of the things that it really boils down to, because we're both trying to analyze the economic impact of solar plus storage day to day, and then also how much resilience can you get from the solar and battery investment, is the sunlight in to the load, the energy used. That ratio matters a lot. And across California in 2 seasons, here we're looking at January in the first row and August in the second row. We show the ratio of sunlight in to the energy used on an average day out there on the scale on the right. And what you can see in the winter, especially for community centers, which have some of the highest energy used day to day compared to the other buildings, it's hard. You end up having in the winter more load out than sunlight in. Now, if you look in August, the whole row across August, it gets much easier. In some places, you have 150% sunlight versus the energy used. And in those cases, solar and battery can provide enough energy. But what this really highlights is even in August, check out the community center in the far left lower column, in the inland deserts, even though the sunlight is very good, the energy use to cool those spaces is so high that you still have a hard time keeping up. And what I really want to highlight from this is there are regional differences, building type differences for rooftop constrained solar to meet the energy needs for these buildings. And if we go to the next slide, what that ends up meaning, and on the right hand, you see the utility, the 10-ish largest utilities in California. And the left is the upfront capital cost per square foot for a resilience hub to serve a 4-day outage with a critical load that is 50% of the normal load, considering the highest net energy month, that hardest month when that ratio from the previous slide is the hardest to meet. And what we see, two things really drive the cost. And one is the climate and season. In the desert Southeast, that summer heat is really hard to keep up. And then in a lot of the rest of the country, it's really, it's the hardest season is the winter when the sunlight isn't as available. And then another thing you can just start to see is the urban versus rural challenge, where the cities are harder. And if you look right in the center of California, right in the Sacramento area, there's a city where the neighboring communities have the same solar and should have a pretty similar load, except that in cities, the buildings have more floors on average. And then your solar roof space to floor space ratio changes. And that's also harder to meet. And that does, if we look at the next slide, one of the big challenges then is not just the capital upfront cost, how much does it cost to build the thing? And actually, let's go back one slide. Costs range from $10 per square foot to $35 per square foot across these buildings. But if we look at the economic value on the next slide, the economic value can range from negative $30 to more than $10. And that really comes down to a function of what does the solar and battery pay for itself during normal operations? And that's a function of the utility rate. Does the utility pay you for solar that you export back to the grid? How much does the energy cost in normal operations that then lets the solar offset high energy prices? And what we see from this is the desert Southeast, the inland deserts are still really hard with a negative $30 per square foot of cost. And those cities in the Central Valley also are challenging. And part of this is from the utility, where, for example, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District has relatively affordable energy, but doesn't have a time of use rate that rewards solar and battery storage. And that can be seen across the state in some of the other utility regimes. And then highlighting the Southeast, we see in the Central Valley, in Imperial, in the Imperial Irrigation District has some of the highest costs, but you move slightly towards the coast and there's a clear line in San Diego where that is served by the San Diego gas and electric, where it goes from being highly negative net present value to a highly positive net present value. And that's really just a function of the utility regime. And I think I can pass it to our next speaker.
I think that's me. So hi, everyone. My name is Janelli. I'm a scientist in PSE. So in addition to identifying all these potential candidate resilience hubs and estimating the solar and storage for each of those buildings, we also created a climate vulnerability index for the state of California and the census tract level. And we base this index on the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program definition of climate vulnerability. So based on this definition, vulnerable communities experience like higher risk of exposure to climate hazards. They have increased population sensitivity, and they also have a low level of adaptive capacity to recover and withstand climate impacts. So based on this definition, we created a framework for a climate vulnerability index that includes two major components: population sensitivity and adaptive capacity. Under the population sensitivity component, we included indicators for sensitive population groups, for example, elderly populations, children, people with cardiovascular diseases, outdoor workers, etc. We also included indicators for cumulative environmental burden. And then for the adaptive capacity, we include like a range of indicators for socioeconomic, social, and population, as well as infrastructure capacity. So all of those indicators were integrated into a score so that every census tract in the state receive a climate vulnerability score. And if you're interested in learning more about the specific indicators that we included, Adrian will share in the chat a link to a Google Sheet where we list all of the indicators that were included in each of the components of the climate vulnerability index. So after we estimated a climate vulnerability score for each of the census tracts in the state, we did a percentile ranking so that we can compare the score of one census tract relative to the other census tracts in the state. And those census tracts that are ranked in like the higher percentiles are the most vulnerable census tracts. So this is similar to what to the percentile ranking and the Cohen-Barrow screen score, which you see here on the right side on the screen. So in Cohen-Barrow screen, the census tracts that are ranked in the top 75 percentile are designated as disadvantaged census tracts. Based on that cutoff, if we compare our climate vulnerability index to Cohen-Barrow screen, there is a lot of overlap. So a lot of the census tracts that are identified as vulnerable in Cohen-Barrow screen are also identified as vulnerable in the climate vulnerability index. But there is also some differences. For example, in the northern region of California, there is a number of census tracts that receive a higher ranking in the climate vulnerability index relative to the ranking that they receive in the Cohen-Barrow screen score, in the Cohen-Barrow screen framework. The increase on the ranking is not enough to push those census tracts to the top 75%, to the top 75 percentile. But interestingly, we also identify 365 additional disadvantaged census tracts in our climate vulnerability index. So that means that this 365 census tracts are ranked as vulnerable, are ranked in the top 75 percentile in our climate vulnerability index, but they are not ranked as vulnerable in Cohen-Barrow screen. So when we look more closely into those additional census tracts and compare those to the census tracts in the top 75 percentile of Cohen-Barrow screen, we see that on average, the additional census tracts we identify have a lower cumulative environmental impact, but they have similar socioeconomic levels to census tracts that are disadvantaged in Cohen-Barrow screen, and they also have low levels of capacity. For example, here in the box plots distributions in blue, you see those additional census tracts that we identify, and in orange, you see that the disadvantaged census tracts identified by Cohen-Barrow screen. So on average, those additional census tracts have a higher energy burden. And also on average, those census tracts have a higher value for the urban heat island index. And when it comes to climate hazards, they also are in high risk of exposure to certain climate hazards. For example, on average, they have a higher number of projected extreme hot days and a higher concentration of wire-related PM 2.5 concentrations relative to those census tracts that are classified as vulnerable in Cohen-Barrow screen. So we package all of this information into a web tool that is publicly available. And I will give you like a quick walkthrough of the tool. Let me just change my screen. Okay, so here is, so the web tool, which Adrian can share the link in the chat, is publicly available and include the information that Patrick presented on the Candidate Resilience Hub. So, and the left side of the tool, you have a column with multiple filters for the Candidate Resilience Hub. So you can filter the Candidate Resilience Hub based on building type. The sites are represented as dots on the map. So if you're interested only in looking at school buildings, you can filter only for school buildings. You can zoom in into different regions of California. For example, here, zooming into the Fresno area. You can also filter the buildings by the electric utility. This is not an exhaustive list, but includes the 2 major utilities in California and a couple of the small ones. You can also filter by building size. So if your community is interested on multiple small resilience hubs rather than a large resilience hub, you can filter by size of the building. You also have a filter for rooftop solar and storage capacity. There is also a filter for upfront solar and storage costs per seed. This is what Patrick just presented about the capital costs of setting up the solar and storage. We also have a filter for lifetime solar and storage value per seed, and this is the value of the investment over a 20-year lifetime period for the solar and storage. So you have all these filters for the Candidate Resilience Hubs, and then on the right side there is a couple filters that pertain to underserved and overburdened populations, and this corresponds to the color of the census tracts and the map. And here you have the Climate Vulnerability Index, which I just introduced you to. We also include here the column bar screen, and as well as percentage low income households. And if you are interested on just looking into census tracts that are designated as vulnerable and under California SB 535, you can filter for just those census tracts. We also have a filter for Justice 40 if you want to see what census tracts are designated as vulnerable under Justice 40 as well. And because our Climate Vulnerability Index doesn't include information about climate hazards, we included here multiple layers and filters for climate hazards. We have the projected extreme heat days, so the number of projected extreme heat days in each of the census tracts. We have average wildfire related particle concentrations, as well as ozone exceedance and PM 2.5 exceedance areas. Here in the web tool, you can also find a filter for the PSPS data that Bethany put together. So if you want to filter census tracts based on the number of PSPA events, you can use this filter. So in addition to all these filters, you can also click on a census tract, and it will there will be like a pop-up where you can find a little, additional details about that census tract, and the same for the resilience hubs. You can also click on a building and learn more about that specific building. And lastly, we have a a wildland fire hazard severity zone layer. So you can, for example, the layer for very high wildland fire hazard severity zone. So you can see whether the census tracts in your community are adjacent to one of those zones. And I think that's a quick walkthrough. Now I will pass it on to Elena to do a quick use a scenario of how you can leverage from the data that is included in this tool.
Thanks, Yaneli. So I'm going to share my screen. And does everyone see that okay?
We're seeing the Ronald show agenda. So no,
that is not what we want to share. Stop share. Interesting. Let me try that one more time. How about now?
That looks good.
Great. Okay. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Yaneli. So I'm going to take a look at my neighborhood where I live and think about how we might use this tool near me. So this is Oakland. I'm going to zoom in here. I live in this neighborhood here. We're right sort of near Lake Merritt. And a couple of things that I'll sort of notice right off the bat. I have the filter on right now for Cal Enviroscreen. We're kind of in the middle of the pack on Cal Enviroscreen. This is a somewhat disadvantaged community. It's near more disadvantaged communities, not too far away. If I click on the census tract, I can see that that's it. We're exactly 50 percentile. More disadvantaged than half of California, less disadvantaged than half California. Climate vulnerability index isn't that high. That makes sense to me. It's not that hot in Oakland. We don't have that much smoke compared to everybody else. And I guess actually those are the climate hazards, take that back. But it seems somewhat reasonable to me. We're not a Justice 40 disadvantaged community right here. But what I do know is that there are a lot of low-income households nearby. And in fact, it says here that 30% of my census tract is low income. I also happen to know, and it's not here, that there's a huge immigrant population nearby. A lot of people who don't speak English and might be a somewhat vulnerable population that is not, 100% captured in some of this data tool. So I think that's one of the takeaways. We can use this tool in order to find some information, and we also have to wed that with what we actually know about what is around us. So if I were going to think about applying for a hub, I would sort of look around here and say, all right, we're in, our air quality is marginal. We're not in great ozone air quality. Particulate matter is kind of okay. We might face some public safety power shutoffs. It's not too high. We're going to have increasing extreme heat going forward. And I know that we're facing additional smoke. So if I'm thinking about a resilience hubs application, all of those things could potentially go in. And again, I know that there are other vulnerable communities that are sort of hidden in some of this data that are starting to come out. If I look around, I also can look at potential sites. I know that there is, I think this is a synagogue up here, not too far away, but I'm also going to think about two other places that I know in my neighborhood. One of them is the middle school down the street. And what we actually can look at for this community is, according to Cal Enviroscreen, again, sort of 50th percentile, it's actually considered a Justice 40 disadvantaged community. That means it might qualify for additional funding under Justice 40, even if it doesn't under Cal Enviroscreen's, the funding in California. Yeah? Someone took off mute for a second. Anyway, so we can sort of use this tool to say like, oh, hey, this actually might qualify for different kinds of funding. And if I take a look at the middle school, which is right here, it also has 89% of its students qualify for free and reduced price lunch. What that means is that this is a place in my community that is serving some of the most vulnerable populations nearby. And I know this, and I know that the teachers here are dedicated and had an 18-day hunger protest last year to keep the Unified School District from shutting the place down. So if I'm going to start thinking about a place that I know is already in contact with some of the most vulnerable populations nearby, this might be where I would start. I also would take a look at the church down the street, also qualifies for some Justice 40 funding, as we saw by looking at that census tract data. And I know that this church is a place that hosts community events. I'm not particularly religious. My mom's Jewish, but I've been here because they host a whole broad array of events that other people come to, and they're a known place and a trusted place already in our community. So those might be the two places that I would start to look at that I know are already embedded in the community, that are, have dedicated staff that are reached out and are serving possibly, some of the populations nearby who might most need a resilience hub. If I'm trying to think about, again, where we might think about qualification for funding, I'll look for things again, like, is this a Justice 40 community? If you qualify for free and reduced price lunch, there's funding for schools, and that can get stacked in as well. And I can also, let's say you're applying for a resilience hub thing, take a look here and pull in number of extreme heat days, what some of those extreme climate events are, and other things into any kind of grant application. That being said, if I were a community planner, I might zoom out a little bit and look across some of the other areas in our community and say, oh, hey, you know, some of these look even more vulnerable. I can switch over to the Climate Vulnerability Index and start to explore some of the additional neighborhoods that I think, you know, these are all the historically redlined areas in Oakland that might need additional support, and think about whether some of these might be candidate sites. Are the community organizations working there to partner with? Are these places that might need additional funding and additional support? We can go in here and look at some of the solar and storage data. This is, again, based on a 50% of normal energy for a 3-day outage. And this can give a sense of how much money is going to be needed up front to sort of support solar and storage bill up for a resilience hub. This is all going to be case dependent. Each of this is going to really depend on the site where you're working. So I'm going to leave it at that. And I think that Adrian is putting a poll in the chat to get a sense of where everybody is from, which we'd love you to answer. And then we would love to open it up for questions and see, where are you working? What are some of the challenges that you're facing? And are there data here? Is there information here that you could use? Do you have questions about the tool and how you might use it? We'll give you a minute to answer the poll and see where we've got. Northern and Southern California coming in strong. Our poll me seems to be missing some regions. Apologies if you're from the Sierras. I don't know where that goes. A mix of urban, suburban, and rural. I think we're seeing really different challenges in each place, certainly in terms of travel distance, where people might have to go. There's a lot of different considerations in each of those kinds of places. And a lot of folks who are just sort of starting to think about resilience hubs. Someone's building. That's exciting. I want to hear about that. Some people are applying for funding, and others who are early stage planning. Central Valley, a couple outside of California. Great. Okay, so there's a decent amount of coverage here. We'd love to open up for questions.